Welcome to the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. In this series, we'll bring you 12 of the best talks from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. This episode is called Organised Crime in the UK.
My name is Dr. FELIA ALLUM. I am Professor at the University of Bath in comparative organised crime and corruption. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable on organised crime in the UK. And it's my pleasure to invite you to this discussion around organised crime in the UK. We're very lucky to have three very different speakers, but three speakers who are going to bring, I think, some interesting knowledge and ideas and debates to the table around organised crime in the UK. I'll what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them to present themselves, and then we will start having a discussion. Before I do that, I just want to note that the idea behind this roundtable was the idea very much that we talk about organised crime, we talk about transnational organised crime, we talk about global organised crime, and we always seem to suggest that organised crime doesn't exist in the UK, or that the type of organised crime that we see in films doesn't exist in the UK. And so this roundtable is an opportunity for us to reflect about what kind of organised crime does exist in the UK, what it looks like, and how it challenges our society in general, but also different levels of the economy and sectors of society, if you want. So this is a trying to sort of self-meditate and self-reflect with three speakers based in the UK about what organised crime looks like, how it manifests itself, and how we must also, I think, be aware of its existence and be aware that it's not someone else's problem, or it doesn't exist here. And if we don't acknowledge it, then we're not really going to deal with it. And I think that's one of the things that this roundtable hopefully will underline, that the importance of also looking at home rather than just looking abroad and someone else's problem. So with that in mind, or having said that, I will now ask Stan Gilmour if he can just briefly present himself. Then I will ask Dr. Ella Cockbain if she can present herself, and then Francesco Garcias if they can just briefly give us an overview of who they are. After that, Stan will then do just a simple presentation around what he thinks organised crime looks like in the UK, or how he comes across it, and that is the main theme of the first intervention that each person will make. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Stan Gilmour. I'm the director of the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit. We are a multi-agency organisation focused on what has become known as a public health approach to prevention. So multi-agency approach to prevention. Today I'm going to speak to you about how we focus on prevention in three different domains. I won't go into that yet, but that will be my focus. Thanks.
Thank you. Ella?
Hi, I'm Ella Cockbain. I'm an associate professor at UCL in the Department of Security and Crime Science, and my work focuses primarily on human trafficking, various forms of labour exploitation and child sexual exploitation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ella. Francisco?
Hi there, I'm Francisco Garcia. I'm a freelance writer and journalist with publications like The Guardian, Vice, New Statesman, Rolling Stone, and many others. I mainly write about what I guess you could broadly term as crime and society. My first book was published last year by HarperCollins. It was a study of the missing persons crisis in the UK, which led me on to various aspects of organised crime that are involved with that very thorny and complicated topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. So Stan, we're going to go in the following order. I thought it would be best if we started with a practitioner's voice. Whether that's a good or bad idea, I don't know, but give the floor to Stan as the practitioner, then have the academic Ella, and then have the kind of representative of civil society, if you want, as Francesco, just giving us a brief overview of how they see organised crime in the UK, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philia. The public health approach to prevention takes a view that late prevention, also known as tertiary prevention, is far too expensive on society as well as on the public purse. And earlier prevention is much more beneficial an individual in family and community, neighbourhood and social terms. So at the Violence Reduction Unit, we focus on universal or primary early prevention, targeted or secondary prevention, and then specialist or tertiary prevention. And this slide, apologies, it is very busy, but this slide lays out our approach so that we manage to capture as far as we can those domains across a life course, but also across intercept points with the system. So if I just explain very briefly what we're looking at here, the main boxes in the centre, intercept 0 is where community services are providing the support they need to prevent people from being drawn into vulnerability. And our approach to vulnerability is very much that it's a systemic issue, that people are not inherently vulnerable, provided they have access to the services and support they need to keep themselves or their families safe. And really, it's only at the point of crisis where, for example, the police may get involved, and the first role of the police is to preserve life and protect individuals. So they should be thinking about how they can refer people back into community support rather than drawing them into criminalisation, which we know can be a bad thing. So the focus of the Violence Reduction Unit is to look to see how we can support our communities, to build resilience with community organisations, and to build support from public services that don't undermine that resilience building. And to make sure that when people come into contact with services, that their needs are properly identified and addressed, so that they can be supported back in the community. Now, we take this approach because we are looking very much at risk and protective factors. There's a very recent study, a Campbell collaboration systematic review on risk factors for people being drawn into organised crime. And those risk factors are pretty much the same. The framing may be different, the syntax may be different, but the risk factors are pretty much the same as many of the risk factors we see across criminology in terms of why people get drawn into and involved in crime. They are, as always, very gendered. With organised crime, we are all too often only talking about the boys and men. And one of the approaches that we're taking in the VRU, the Violence Reduction Unit, is to try and engender the conversation so that we're actually picking out risk factors that are problematic for girls and women, and not just those that are worrisome for boys and men. So risk factors for involvement in organised crime, or crime more generally, tend to be things like early indications of criminality, early indications of violence, a disorganized, disrupted family, support from friends, peers and family to become involved in crime or organised crime in this case. So very kind of common set of risk factors, and the approaches we take are to try and build resilience against those issues at a very early stage, as early as we can. And the pink boxes on the top are kind of examples of specific evidence-based interventions to undermine those risk factors and provide protective factors for individuals. Now, as we run through the intercepts, we get deeper into the criminal justice system and later on in a life course, where we have to become much more specialist and much more kind of costly in the way that we deal with individuals. But we always take a multi-agency approach to this, always looking at diversion, always looking at community resilience to build support for people and to address individual needs as people age through the system, and make sure that we are putting the system together to provide the best possible outcome for those involved. And I'm very happy to talk about that much more as we go through the conversation, but I think for now that's enough from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stan. Ella, would you like to give your overview of how you come into contact or see or engage with what looks like organised crime in the UK?
Yeah, so like I said, the vast majority of my work has focused on specific areas around trafficking and labour abuse and child sexual exploitation. So I can't pretend, and I don't want to talk about organised crime in general. It may well be that some of the points I raised do resonate with other forms of organised crime, and it would be interesting to hear the other participants and people who are here listening, what your thoughts are on that. But when we're thinking specifically about human trafficking and the more extreme forms of exploitation that fall under this so-called modern slavery umbrella, I think there's a few key things that really cannot be drawn out enough. And the first is that this is a field that is absolutely riddled with myths and really kind of sweeping generalizations and very dubious statistics and claims. So I guess my first point would be it's very important to engage critically in this area. In fact, what we're dealing with under this, trafficking or modern slavery umbrella is really complex and contested territory. And there's lots of very distinct issues that fall under that have some commonalities, but require quite different approaches to analysis and responses. So some of the work we're doing at the moment with the support of the National Crime Agency has been looking at patterns in referrals to the UK's national referral mechanism. So that's the formal process by which people are officially identified or not as suspected victims of modern slavery. And you see in there just such wildly different issues that it cannot be that the same response would be effective in terms of, for example, trafficking of British children within the UK for sexual exploitation, or trafficking for county lines related criminalisation, criminal exploitation, versus trafficking of Albanian women to Italy for sexual exploitation, who then come to detention in the UK. I mean, these are very different issues. So thinking that a one-size-fits-all approach will work, I think, is dangerous. The other thing is this is a very politicized area, and there are a lot of hidden interests and hidden agendas. I think probably the most salient and obvious right now is this morning, Emily Dugan reported in The Guardian that the government has moved modern slavery from the portfolio of the safeguarding minister into the portfolio of a minister for illegal immigration and asylum. And that tells you a lot about the political priorities and how those interact with responses. It's also something that I think is terrifying in terms of how dangerous and how misguided it is based on the evidence we know about these issues. And that's for several reasons. Firstly, because these are issues that extreme exploitation causes very serious harms. There's very good evidence from the public health field on that. Often affects already very marginalized people. And then this assumption that it can be tied up neatly with irregular migration is really misguided, because again, it ignores the fact that we know that a lot of the exploitation identified in the UK, and there are biases in that identification process, but a lot of it ties up with the exploitation of British nationals, particularly British children. So again, putting it under so-called illegal immigration really ignores that. We also know there's a lot of exploitation, for example, various forms of labour exploitation involving EU nationals who came into the UK voluntarily through regular channels, but were deceived about the prospects awaiting them, and then subject to oftentimes really horrendous exploitation. And again, that's a key thing to really stress here, that when we look critically at the kind of constructions and the narratives and the political messaging around these issues, that is not to say that there are not very real and serious harms, because there are, and that deserves a sensible, informed, evidence-based approach. that recognises this complexity, that disaggregates very distinct issues, and that puts far more of a premium than has been the case to date on addressing various knowledge gaps, including around evaluation. So very, very little is known about what's effective in tackling trafficking and exploitation, despite the fact that there's been enormous amounts of spending in this area since, particularly since the 2000s onwards. And also particularly concerning, there's a lot of spending, not only without evidence to know that it's necessarily effective, but with a growing body of evidence to suggest that anti-trafficking interventions can actually have some very dangerous consequences for already marginalised groups, either in terms of unintended consequences or issues that were predictable and predicted, but yet kind of swiped to the sides in the interest of a broader agenda. So obvious examples there, for example, are the way anti-trafficking has often harmed sex workers, for example, or irregular migrants. So yeah, I guess that's a sort of brief summary of some of the things I see as being the key issues here. And I will hand over to the others.
Thank you very much, Ella. That was, yes, very intense, also quite depressing, but I suppose that's part of what we do. But yeah, highlighting some really important issues around exploitation, modern slavery as is in the UK at the moment. Francesca, would you like to add your voice or your experience or your overview of how you see organised crime in the UK today?
Yeah, I might not have a terrific amount to say perhaps directly to that, but I thought it might be quite helpful to talk about my experience when I was reporting the Missing Persons book, which was a years-long project, which I started off with a few assumptions that were probably quite quickly and pretty thoroughly debunked. I'd started that journey, for want of a better word, with certain things in mind, trying to explain this apparent crises and these enormous numbers of people go missing every year. Of course, likely a significant underestimate. I was interested in the way that the figures were recorded and the sort of very, very lively and unreconciled and unending debate going on within various between various agencies and various bodies about these numbers in the first place. I thought, I came in with my sort of journalist being interested in social issues hat on. I knew it had something or suspected it had something to do with, terrifying cuts in services that left people more vulnerable, the safety net being emaciated down to something of a trapeze wire over the last 10, 12, perhaps more years. And the story got much more complicated the more I sort of drilled down into it, and of course rubbed up against several things to do with criminality and organised crime within the UK, particularly county lines. I can't pretend to be a trailblazer in making that connection between county lines and missing, and there's some terrific reporting done by a colleague of mine, Max Daly, which served as a bit of a template, and I tried to drill down into that. And also to speak to Ella's point as well, sort of, I think it's important to deal with these things critically. And the more I drilled down, the more even the numbers, this supposed 180,000, or at least that's what it was in 2019 when I started my reporting, they're being reported missing every year. On interrogation, those numbers seem a bit porous. And the more I drilled down, the more complicated the picture became. So county lines, human trafficking was an enormous part of that reporting. To my shame, I would love to go far deeper into that link, and I'm hoping to do so in the coming months actually, but can't talk too much about that at the moment. And after that, so beyond missing, I also broadly write about crime within the UK. I'm interested in the sort of representations of crime. I'm interested in the actual subject of crime reporting. I think it's fascinating, the ways it's good and bad, and very often bad. I'm interested in getting around the UK quite a bit to, without sounding like a total cliche, uncover some stories perhaps that aren't just in major cities, or perhaps even cities that aren't that well reported in the press nationally. Again, I would love to drill into examples, but I can't say a lot about certain things. I'm actually working with FELIA on a few stories, which I'm very excited about. Yeah, I mean, what I would say from a reporter's perspective as well is that it's been an interesting process for me to try and there's been interesting work going on in America at the moment about journalistic practice to do with crime reporting and disentangling from sort of just using police sources, etc., and trying to sort of widen the net. Something I'm very interested in. Yeah, and just embracing the sort of complexity of that picture. And if you're interested in social issues in the UK, you can't then ignore crime because these things are so intrinsically linked. Hopefully I have something more interesting to say when the discussion opens up, but thank you.
Thank you very much for that reflection about the report, the approach of coming from a reporter's perspective. So the three kind of different overviews that you've presented, if I can ask a question and open it up, and perhaps I don't know whether at the same time Stan or Ella have got questions to each other or to Francesco, but it's the idea of, on the one hand, recruitment, and on the other, I suppose, the conditions or the conditions that make people vulnerable. In other words, are we in a situation today in the UK where we have certain mechanisms that are taking place or working out where there is a community of vulnerability, or a community that is becoming vulnerable and open to being recruited or being caught up in various things that means that they end up as potential either members of or victims to organised crime. So if you could just perhaps reflect around the notion of recruitment. I mean, Ella, you also talked and mentioned the idea of, you know, modern slavery being seen very much as, to a certain extent, this idea that it's somewhere else, or it's just other ethnicities and other groups. And I was just wondering, again, from your work, whether we could just reflect about recruitment and the conditions that exist in today's society, and then perhaps we can also then talk and deal with the idea of all this being kind of politicized. But what about generally in the local communities? What kind of conditions are making people vulnerable? What's going on in terms of young people getting caught up, or even middle-aged people getting caught up in these activities? I don't know whether you have any reflections about that, Stan or Ella.
I'm very happy to kick off. Just listening to what's been said there, and you know, specifically Ella's points around the drift that we see. It's a very common feature of organised crime, and is the kind of securitization agenda that runs alongside it. And there's always an interplay, and we're perhaps seeing some of that in practice now within your sphere, Ella. In terms of, you know, vulnerability, FELIA, around, you know, what's making people vulnerable, we know from research, and it's you know, decades and decades old now, the way that organised crime works, when local you know, when local practice doesn't support individuals from a kind of the state's perspective, then they start taking care of their own business. And I guess there's an issue at the moment around kind of multiple and layered vulnerabilities. We've had COVID and what that's done to communities. We've got issues that we all know about around global security and around kind of cost of living. You know, issues reported pretty regularly around access to justice, access to health, access to education, etc. So all of those access issues, I think, come together in different ways for different population groups, and they have the ability to exclude people in different ways. And it's that exclusion that makes for vulnerability, because something fills that gap where people have a need, they seek a mechanism to fulfill that need, or others seek ways that they can flood into that vacuum, and we start to see informal ways for things to be resolved, and you know, that's that kind of extra legal governance, that kind of organised crime, you know, comes in to fill the gap. So I think we're in a particular state of vulnerability at the moment, just because of all those layered issues, but there's also an opportunity for us to do something about it by working much more closely together, and I'm sure Ella's going to have a lot to say about this, about how we could work together more effectively, because when you start to look at some of the processes that are in place, they're not always as joined up as they need to be. So I think working together effectively, identifying need and where the system excludes, and building that resilience within public services, but within communities as well, is a kind of necessary feature. And to the point of, you know, the framing of the dialogue around crime, again, we've seen changes in that framing that have happened with intensity, I would say, over the last 5 years. And we need to be thinking about that. That's why I'm really pleased to hear Francisco mentioning it, because when you frame crime and organised crime in a way that points towards a securitization agenda, then you start to have mindful interventions that produce inequality and that produce exclusion, and we have to be guarded against that. We have to make sure that we are alert to that as it's happening. That's my throw in. I don't know what.
Yeah. Can I just ask you a question in relation to that then, Stan? From your perspective, would you say that, I don't know, I'm going to put you on the spot, whether organised crime you feel is actually a priority in the police force at the moment, or is it not prioritised, or is it unpackaged in a way that, you know, we make it into different forms of crime rather than a general idea of organised crime? Because obviously organised crime is so complicated, and as Ella mentioned, also sort of, you know, myths and stereotypes are easily put with that. But do you find that, you know, the framing of it is organised crime something that the police is interested in, or is it kind of, we've just got so many other things going on that we're not kind of necessarily prioritising our understanding towards it?
And I feel that police and law enforcement more generally in the UK are very focused on organised crime at a very kind of local level, and there is resources looking at it at a kind of transnational level as well. But it is, as kind of Ella's mentioned, it is difficult to retain a focus on what to do about it when there is a stretch. So I think we're always at risk of being pulled in too many different directions. But that is the nature of organised crime. It's not one thing. It's a vast number of different things. But that's why we take the approach of kind of risk factors and being focused on them rather than on how necessarily it plays out, because it plays out in so many different ways, born from the very same familiar risk factors. You know, we know where crime and organised crime ends. You know, it ends in the kind of despair that we read about, that we see. Often generally begins in those adverse experiences within a kind of somebody's life journey. It's how those things come together in the middle that are much more complex. But if we can focus on early prevention of building systems that identify need to prevent vulnerabilities from growing, then that, in my view, is the way that we can tackle this without being drawn into specific areas, specific commodities, specific thematics, and to do a much better job of pulling the system together for prevention.
Thank you. Ella, can you also talk to the idea of, you know, how or perhaps explain to us a bit around your research in terms of how young people perhaps get caught up in human trafficking, what that looks like from your specific research? Because it's, I wouldn't say sexy, but we talk a lot about human trafficking, and as you pointed out, and I agree, we don't actually know what that looks like or what it actually means, and it means a lot of different things to different people. So I just wish whether you could just perhaps, you know, give us your overview of what human trafficking in the UK looks like. And again, as you say, there's also a kind of quite a push to identify and accept that actually there are a lot of British victims to human trafficking, and it's not just women, as you say, Albanian women who've been trafficked to Italy and who end up in the UK. Obviously, that is there is that pool of women, but also understand that, you know, British children are also part of that vulnerability and part of. So if you could just give us an overview, a better understanding of your research and your findings around that, I think it'd be very interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sorry to be that person over and over. It really depends. I guess what What maybe makes trafficking a little different from some of the other areas is there's a sort of dual process of recruitment or involvement, whichever way you look at it, in that there's an involvement as an offender, and then there's also a kind of recruitment and involvement as someone who's being exploited, so offender victim, so to speak. And there's a real tendency to kind of oversimplify both of those and frame it as these kind of super organized criminal masterminds on the offending side, and then kind of very, very kind of idealized versions of victimhood that real people can't often live up to because no one could. And in reality, it all gets a lot more messy. And one thing that we see quite a lot in trafficking is this sort of interplay between offending and victimization, and that then presenting really, really fundamental challenges for responses. And I don't think there's necessarily any easy answers at all. I think it's an issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention because it is so important and it's so challenging from the perspective of, what do you do if you have someone who themselves has been heavily exploited, but is also kind of grooming or exploiting or contributing to harms against others. And that's particularly challenging when you're dealing with children, but it's also very, very challenging when you're dealing with adults. So I mean, there's been huge research gaps around offenders, funnily enough, in the trafficking field. So it's an area that there's comparatively little which is known about. There's some really good new work from Rose Broad and Dave Gadd at Manchester, where they interviewed modern slavery offenders in prison. And again, very much echoing some of the things we've found around child sexual exploitation and around labour trafficking, that this kind of hyper-organised criminal masterminds thing just doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And things like opportunism often play much more of a role. And also recognising, and I think this probably resonates very much with what Stan was saying about how just because people do horrible things, it doesn't mean that they haven't also been through horrible things. And this isn't me trying to justify harms in any way, shape or form, because the harms are very real, but recognising that, oftentimes you are dealing with people who've had pretty rubbish run of it themselves as well. And that's then, so yeah, no easy answers. I'm a big fan of starting to think more in terms of a kind of public health type model and actually paying attention to prevention, because there's been a lot of lip service around prevention over the years. And oftentimes you find that, the things that are framed as prevention are really just awareness raising, and it's not necessarily actually going to help if you're not kind of offering better alternatives and exit ramps and the support that's needed. Like Francisco, I think the decimation of public services plays an important role. I don't think it plays the only role. And I think kind of when people do explain it in that terms, as if it's all down to that, I think that's a bit simplistic as well. Yeah, we need to look a lot more at kind of how harms concentrate. You see that around missing, for example, missing children. Oftentimes it's a relatively small proportion of children that are going, contributing for a very, very large amount of missing incidents. Those are the type of instances where I would be particularly concerned about exploitation risks, not to say that there aren't risks elsewhere as well. But yeah, looking at those kind of concentrations and patterns, but also understanding what we are seeing and what we're not seeing and some of the reasons that might be the case. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you. No, I thought that was really, really helpful and really interesting. And I totally agree with you. I think that there is an oversimplification around what organised crime is or what it actually looks like. And I don't know how we unpack that in the terms of, we can accept that it's contentious, definitions are contentious. We don't all agree on the same kind of definition, but when you actually go and look at reality, there's very little organisation. There's a lot of opportunism. There's a lot of survival strategies at play. And I think that we don't really kind of engage with that. We sort of talk about organised crime as it's like a golden standard and everybody knows what we mean by it. But actually, if you're looking at what's going on in the street, especially in the UK, a lot of them are not really organised, and a lot of them are, also have their own trauma, have their own kind of journeys. And also, as I think an important point that you make is we don't acknowledge the kind of complicated relationship that offenders and victims have, and that a victim can be a perpetrator and vice versa, and we still haven't really got to grips with that, and we don't really understand how that works out. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of issues, and the narratives, the established narratives, are very difficult to unpack. Francesco, have you got anything that you would like to add to what you've just heard?
Yeah, certainly. I think I can only speak for what I see, particularly through my sources, who I tried to stick with for a long time, who I've known for a long time, who are involved in, I suppose, what we call criminality, and maybe have been for a long time. I'm interested about vulnerability because it's such a complicated term. When I talk to people and try and talk to them about their lives and their histories of just their own personal histories, and perhaps they wouldn't very rarely, I'm talking about people on sort of street level, particularly in some of the major cities in the UK, they don't really see themselves as vulnerable, although perhaps they are really. In some cases they're certainly vulnerable to violence, they're certainly vulnerable to the sort of general travails of being on road or being on the street or whatever you want to call it. Did they see themselves being recruited when they were teenagers? Again, probably not. It's probably there was no sort of student union recruitment fair where you get sort of brought into your local, I suppose what you call a gang. I don't know. They might see it. They don't even see it as a gang. They might see it as something completely different to that. So yeah, a lot of these people that I know, a lot of people again I've worked with for many years and know fairly well. It's not something static. Their status, the way they actually live. Some people, it's probably I don't know if it's a helpful way of talking about it, but they sort of pinball in and out of what you call criminality. There are lots of periods where they're not involved. They're doing something else with their lives, and then something will occur. Perhaps you would call that a vulnerability opening up in their life, maybe, and they're dragged back into doing whatever they were doing before. So it's fluid. It doesn't really stay static. It's not. Again, it's not. You can't. These aren't characters in a in a novel or something. They're not written characters. They're actually people with three-dimensional people with complicated lives. Often, as we all have complications to our lives, but they've got. It's not, and their self-perception isn't quite. Some of them are frank about the fact that they're involved in criminality. But they don't perceive themselves as being sort of organised criminals or like part of this. It's sort of it'd be ludicrous to them if I started coming out with that to them. They would just think that's funny, to be honest. Some of them also, I think about this fluidity. I mean, that also involves being in and out of the criminal justice system. And some of my work that I'm trying to sort of build on now is people who were perhaps committed quite serious criminality in their teenage years, in some cases quite high profile crimes, who've been in the criminal justice system for a long time and basically missed their entire adolescences and early adulthood, and are coming out now and emerging into a very different world, and not just in terms of services, but in terms of, how do I put it, a vastly altered society in so many different ways. So I find that's an extremely interesting and quite underreported thing at the moment. So that's something I'm interested in. Also, as I said about harm, I've just finished working on another project about missing people, and this notion of I think I can say this. I think it's fine, but this new body of research has been published by Missing People, and instances of harm with missing being much higher than is recorded in other statistics. But then, what does that harm entail? Again, that's a very complicated, very ambiguous term that could mean so many different things. So anyway, I'll stop there before I ramble too much. But I try and stay with these sources for a long time, and I think a lot of what gets lost maybe is the fact that, these are people navigating a complicated world.
Thank you, Francesco. So if as I said, I think one of the issues is around the complex nature of victims and offenders me being the same people and overlapping and trying to sort of survive in certain contexts, and we don't actually necessarily see them. Another question obviously is being very clear on how we're defining different types of phenomena. I mean, one of the questions I can see coming up, and I'll ask it in a bit, is around how we differentiate from these different forms of organised crime, right? So organised crime is a very general term that we use, and that there's obviously differences with street gangs or youth gangs, organised crime families, and we all mix everything together and we don't really have a clear picture. We're reflecting, I think, at the lower level of the street level, of the level of vulnerabilities and harms that are produced, and how people then get caught up in crime, and how they try and survive. So I suppose the question I want to ask now is in relation to, if we acknowledge that our society is a society where there is a problem such as organised crime, there are two questions I really want to ask which are slightly unconnected. So I'll go with the first one, which is around Stan obviously pushes very much for a public health approach and around prevention and all the problems that actually kind of produces in terms of how do we manage as multi-agency approaches, or how do agencies manage to come together to tackle this problem if we still don't really know what we're looking at, I suppose. And I think, I acknowledge when you say, Stan, that, local police forces know what they're looking at. But if we don't really have a clear idea of whether it's, is it a vulnerability? Is it human trafficking? Is it drug dealing? What is it? How can services come together to have a kind of a clear strategy? And from some of the stuff that I've been doing, I can clearly see that it's very difficult for them to come together because we don't know, and I don't want to say the enemy, but we don't know what the problem is, or we have difficulties. Everybody looks at it differently and comes from a different perspective, so we're all defining things differently. I don't know whether that makes sense as a question, Stan.
Well, let me try and make sense of it. I think one of the issues that we have is that when you put crime in any sentence, then people relax and think, well, that's fine, that's a job for the police. And when you talk about organised crime, you're right, it means different things to everyone. I think the general perception from many is that it means mafias, which is, a facet of organised crime rather than crimes that are organised. So that's why I take the approach that we need to worry less about all of that and more about the vulnerabilities that Francisco's been mentioning. So, people on a life course through the criminal justice system, when you look at the characteristics of those that are engaged with justice services, there are very common threads that run through those people that are engaged with justice. And those are some of the risk factors that I mentioned earlier. And tackling those risk factors is a priority for all agencies. So when you're talking about, again, back to the risk factors that were mentioned in the Campbell study around risk factors for recruitment into organised crime, same risk factors that you see everywhere, they're just framed in different ways. So they talked about low educational attainment. In other areas, the discussion will be around low IQ. They talked about self-control, probably one of the biggest researched areas in criminology around involvement in crime. Others might call that impulsivity. But when you start looking at the characteristics of people that are caught into these systems, you'll often find issues that emanate from their kind of disrupted lives, and both Ella and Francisco kind of mentioned what that might look like for people. So impulsivity may be a feature. If you don't have a lot in your life, you might make some very impulsive choices to grab anything that comes along that looks like it might make you better. Now, whether that's a meal or a drink or a piece of clothing or a friend, we know from research that people that have very little find it more difficult to kind of turn their back on things when they're presented to them. I've just seen Simon's comment pop up, and that was maybe my next point. When you look at characteristics of those caught up in justice services, there are huge neurodiverse and neurodisabling conditions that are very prevalent. So the people that you're talking to, Francisco, I would have thought there would be lots of undiagnosed neurodiverse, neurodisabling issues there because they are so prevalent in justice-involved individuals. So brain injuries, speech, language and communication problems, etc. So when we're looking at self-control or impulsivity, we know that there are various neurodisabling conditions that make people more likely to be easily led, i.e. have poor self-control, i.e. be impulsive. We know that there are cognitive impairments that produce issues for people within education, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a vast array of issues that are common to health, education, social care, and policing. And that's why I think we need to be framing the support, the interventions that are needed in those terms rather than in terms of crime. Because as I said before, I'll say again, as soon as you mention crime, everyone turns their back and says, well, that's fine, the police will deal with that. But we know the issues are much broader than ones that the police can resolve.
Thank you. Ella, have you got any thoughts about that in terms of not looking at it necessarily as groups, but looking more as obviously the vulnerabilities or the conditions that create vulnerabilities and make people vulnerable to then have, you know, to make decisions in certain contexts, which obviously then end up in some form of kind of criminality?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be really careful about the potential for stigmatization as well when we talk about some of these things. And I'm all for evidence, you know, collecting better evidence and evidence-informed approaches. I think we also need to think about, you know, issues built into systems. And I don't know, I honestly, I don't know Stan's area enough to be able to comment sensibly on the stuff he was saying, but some of it made me really uncomfortable listening to it, and it's something I'd like to hear more about and discuss more. But I think, and I don't, from everything he said so far, I don't think this is an intent thing for it to sound really stigmatizing. But I do worry about this idea that, like, well, criminals, it's low IQ, it feels it, and maybe at this point you want a chance to respond, Stan. Not familiar with this field sitting here, it just felt really eugenicsy to me, which I don't think is your intention, but it however this stuff is done, my God, we've got to be careful.
Let me repeat what I said at the start. It's a systemic issue. It is not an issue of individuals. So if people don't get the support they need to remain in full-time education and come out with a good quality of education, that's a systemic issue. But often it's, as you point out, it's a kind of victim blaming or an individual stigmatizing issue. And we know there's a social gradient to all of that as well. We know that, you know, children from poor families are more likely to be diagnosed with a behavioral problem than with a special educational need. And well, we know what happens after that as well, when they are expelled from school and then they end up on the street, going missing and being picked up by organised crime. We know all this from the research. So my point isn't to stigmatize people, it's to draw attention to the systemic failures, because nobody is vulnerable unless they don't have access to the support they need to keep themselves safe. So whether you've got a neurodisability or a neurodivergent condition that produces some problems for kind of mainstream public service or not, it's the service that fails you. It's the lack of provision of the kind of support that you need to thrive that's the problem. There's nothing inherently problematic with individuals. So I'm fully aware of the possibility of stigmatization, but when you look at all of the research, when you look at risk factors for involvement in criminal justice, they're all the same, and they have been for decades. And those risk factors are things that are problems for the system and issues that the system need to deal with, rather than the issues for kind of blaming individuals for the kind of circumstances they find themselves in.
Thanks for responding like that. That's helpful. I guess that was my sort of gut reaction to some of those points. I had, beyond that, I think one thing that is routinely overlooked in the area of crime is the importance of opportunity. So there's a, you know, really kind of growing body of research showing that crime, people are not, you know, like Stan said, people are not inherently criminal. People probably vary in their propensity to commit crime, but one of the factors that then interacts with, propensity is the environment you're operating in. So, and a lot of interventions are focused on this kind of person that's criminal thing. So there's a lot of value in also looking beyond that and looking at the opportunity structures that help produce crime, both in terms of the kind of immediate physical and social environments, and also looking at the broader kind of structures and systems. So in trafficking, for example, one of those structures you would want to be thinking about is immigration policy and opportunities to travel safely and legally. You'd want to be thinking of things like labour market enforcement. And so, so I think the opportunity side gets forgotten a lot, and I think that's a real missed opportunity. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a bad joke. And then the other thing I think that's really worth underlining is that in terms of responses, not all responses need to come from the state. And this is not me saying that there is, I think there's absolutely a role for policing when we're talking about, high harm issues. I worked for a long time on child sexual exploitation. I'm happy, the kind of cases I worked on, I'm happy to see these, the people involved prosecuted. I'm not suggesting getting rid of that, but I think there's an over-reliance on policing. And I think there's part of that is, like Stan said, I think it's involving other agencies, for example, public health agencies, education, etc. But part of it is also looking beyond the structures of the state and thinking about other ways of addressing the situations that render people susceptible to exploitation or put them in situations where they need to do things in order to get by, where it's the least worst option available. So, for example, again, returning to sort of my area of expertise, here, really, really obvious examples are the labour rights movement. So, low paid workers organising, people working on I don't know names, so Deliveroo, Uber Eats, like workers there are organising, and that is a bottom-up mobilisation to try and improve conditions. Very similar what you see around the sex workers' rights movement globally, which is very much kind of grown and grown, and that's about saying it's not rescue, it's not state intervention that we're after. It's about being recognised as workers and being able to work safely and to organise together to improve our material conditions. So I guess that would be an extra sort of missing piece of the puzzle for me, is this assumption. And you see it as well around child sexual exploitation. There's huge amounts of money goes into policing. Policing it properly is very important, don't get me wrong, but neglect of grassroots services, neglect of services that specialise around children from minoritized backgrounds, and those kind of non-state interventions that can be hugely, hugely valuable and are often forgotten about and underfunded.
Thank you. That's very helpful and interesting to sort of counterbalance, as you say, the policing kind of discourse. Francesca, have you got anything else to add before I start looking at some of the questions that have appeared? In terms of missing gap, or what we don't know of what we do know, and also who not whose fight is it, but if the state is weak or not really resilient enough and policing can't do it on their own, how do we kind of create an alternative sort of social capital, if you want? How do we create that when we're obviously also not necessarily in a great place economically as a society?
I might have to come back to that. That's going to require a bit more thought than I can muster right now. But I was going to actually want to say, to pick up on what Ella just said, the thing I hear a lot from people, one of the biggest things is housing. I hear an awful lot about that. Because I hear about that in London, in Glasgow, wherever there's pressure, really. Of course, pressure all over the UK, but where it's particularly acute, you hear that as a huge driver of precarity, and precarity that leads to opportunities for crime. I just wanted to add that, sorry, because it's something that just I was working on earlier today and popped into my head. The missing question is a good one. I'm sorry, I wish I had a fully formed answer on the balls of my feet, but I don't. That's a very good question. So I'll come back to that.
Okay. Is there anything else that either Ella or Stan want to add to what they've said? If not, I am interested, and maybe it's not the right forum to go about how Ella's pointed out the shift with the new government looking at changing certain forms of legislation or certain issues into different forms in particular. And maybe you can comment on this, Ella, the idea that we're moving away from safeguarding into kind of illegal immigration and asylum laws. I think that's quite an interesting shift, if you want, and a different nuance of the problem. I don't know whether you want to comment further. I know you've made a comment about that, but I think it's an interesting shift. And I know that Stan talked about securitization, if you want, of these issues, but that seems to be where we're going more and more, rather than, you know, prevention and bottom up kind of care. Would you like to add something about that particular shift?
Yeah, I mean,
slavery. Sorry.
Another huge development this year was the enactment of the Nationalities and Borders Act, which essentially breaks with international refugee law and seeks to criminalise people based on their method of arrival in this country. And again, I think it points to us heading in a very, very scary direction, and it's very important to inform ourselves and organize and resist around these things. I think it also kind of intersects with some of the things that Francisco's been saying, also what Stan's been saying around securitization, like 100%. I mean, this is classic here. But with what Francesco's saying around responsible reporting, I mean, we have a really, really, we have a very interesting press situation in the UK. Like there's a lot of you know, right-wing press owned by very rich individuals who have very strong interests in issues being framed in a certain way because it fits with broader kind of aspirations and goals. And you see this in, you know, coverage in Daily Mail and the Times and the Telegraph. I'm just going to list off titles until no one wants to talk to me ever again. But I mean, this idea that, you know, that asylum seekers are all criminals, they're all, you know, coming to destroy the British state and British values. I mean, there's grotesque narratives that put out there, to the point, I mean, we did some work earlier this year around the war in Ukraine and the associated risks in terms of trafficking and exploitation. And one of the key arguments that came out of that, and that was an evidence-based roundtable with, you know, over 100 experts participated, lots of different backgrounds, thinking about where the risks lay. And one of the key arguments was that the visa system was in itself creating an exacerbating risk. And that visa system can be seen as a product of the UK's fixation with the hostile environment and kind of migration control. I then got asked to go on Times Radio to talk about this report. And one of the questions I was asked on it was, yeah, but you know, you're saying that one of the key recommendations is to get rid of visas for Ukrainians. But if we do that, surely, you know, all the terrorists are going to come in. And so there's these mad, like extreme scaremongering narratives that have built up over the years. And you see it as well in like another area I work a lot on, which is child sexual exploitation. And this really kind of concerted push over the last decade to frame child sexual exploitation as a Muslim problem. And these are not kind of spontaneous developments. There is a lot of kind of interests behind it and politics that they serve. And I think we have to be enormously careful, and there's a huge role for good critical reporting in the press as well, and we should really celebrate the people that are doing that.
And so that's I suppose the last point I want to make before I go on to some of the questions is the way that, you know, and we have Francesco here to sort of perhaps answer the question, but the idea that perhaps organised crime is now more and more used as a political instrument. I know I did one of my first lectures last week with my fourth years talking about stereotypes and Italian mafia, and they were all very quick onto the idea of using stereotypes as political tools and how you kind of create the other and the fear of the other. And I know that this has happened for a long time, but now it seems as though everybody's coming together to do that, and therefore maybe we're not only making organised crime a kind of space of making it into a security issue like we did a long time ago, but also into a political tool to kind of, I don't know whether it punish the poor or punish whoever the political elite want to, but is there perhaps that danger that, you know, organised crime as you say, there are huge gaps of information. That I think there's a lack of political priority, a lack of political interest in the whole different elements and dimensions of it. But do you think that we are coming to a point where more and more now we are going to use organised crime as a vehicle for going and punishing certain groups or certain ethnic communities or whatever as a result of a political agenda? I just want to maybe capture your thoughts on that, and then I'll get a few questions, because I know we're starting to run out of time. So I don't know whether Stan or Francesca or Ella, you might want to respond to that, the idea that now in particular we can start to see that more and more. Stan?
I think, as ever, there is a risk in othering when the kind of narrative becomes as febrile as it has done and possibly will do more of. We see changes in the way that items are discussed and matters are discussed, and those of us that have been around long enough or are researching this deeply enough can kind of feel the winds of change blowing in the kind of wrong direction in some cases when we're looking at doing things that don't have an evidence base. Now, Ella's point at the start was the kind of lack of an evidence base in this area, and again, that's well reported in terms of organised crime. We don't really have a great evidence base around prevention, do we? And when we start to look at how do we prevent these things from happening, even if we do develop an evidence base, well, who's picking it up? Who's working on that evidence base and actually working alongside it to make it happen? There's a question, if I can address in the chat, that kind of speaks to this really. Around the kind of punitive nature of justice. It's not just justice that's punitive. Every public service can be punitive, whether it's medicine or social care. They all have a punitive edge, don't they? Now, the criminal law, rather than justice itself, the criminal law's there to punish people. It's there to punish people for the non-typical behaviours that are deemed to be criminal. But justice services are not necessarily there to do that. They're there to get the best outcomes, aren't they? The kind of stated aim of kind of youth justice services is to prevent criminalisation. So although the criminal law may be there to punish justice, certainly that's not the main feature of it. The main feature is to get justice, and that doesn't always necessarily mean to punish people. But where the criminal law punishes non-typical behaviour, we have to ask ourselves why some people find it difficult to behave in non-typical ways. And this is to your point, Ella, again, around stigmatisation. That stigmatisation has happened and is happening, and we need to talk about it. So problematising the issue to say, why are there so many people in prison that have a brain injury? Because 70% of people in prison have a brain injury. Why are there so many people in prison that have a speech, language and communication difficulty? Because 90% do. So the question is, why is this happening? The question isn't that it's happening because of those issues. It's happening because of the response to those issues, and that's the place we have to get to say we have to understand why people find it difficult to behave in typical ways, ways that the criminal law frames behaviour. And then we have to understand why that means that many more of them are caught up in these situations where they're exploited and criminalised, because that is happening and that has already happened. And that's the thing that we need to reverse. But we need to be very careful, as you pointed out, on the narrative, because it's quite easy to take this narrative if you are so focused and to pervert it for different outcomes. So we have to maintain a kind of solid stance that community resilience is vastly important, and that public services have a great role to play in that. And it is not simply a job for the police to police our way out of these issues. It's a job for us all to work together to have better outcomes.
Francesco, have you got something to add?
I suppose I just want to go back to Ella's point as well about the politicisation of crime reporting in the press. I mean, that's been going on for an awfully long time, I suppose, but there is a feeling, certainly, that's accelerated and maybe gotten worse in the past, I don't know how many years. I think part of that, I mean, it's not right to hark back to a sort of fantasy golden age where, you know, the fully funded newsrooms, there was money sloshing around. That actually just meant in some cases better funded bad journalism. That was the history of crime reporting in this country for a long time. But I feel, you know, it's not well resourced, particularly investigative reporting work or more in-depth reporting that's actually seriously treating some of these subjects. Well, it takes money and time, and those are commodities that are in pretty short supply within British journalism, and have been for quite a while. How to remedy that, I don't really know. You know, I would love to know, but I guess there's always space for good stuff. Good stuff is always produced. How to improve that situation? I mean, I'm sure there must be a model that works. I just don't know it. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that there are 3 or 4 questions on the chat, but I'm not sure some are directly necessarily relevant. I will perhaps, I mean, there's a question about organ trafficking, but I'm not sure, Ella, whether you've got any information about organ trafficking in the UK, yeah, that's one maybe you can come back to. And then there's a question, obviously, for you, Stan, about punitive. I think you might have covered it, the punitive nature of justice in this country. How challenging is it for you to take a public health approach when you're trying to tackle serious organised crime? I think that's, yeah, I mean, there are a couple of others, but they're more specifically around more specific kind of case studies and sort of general. So I don't know what I'd like to do, because we've only got about 5 minutes left. Perhaps if you could think about the question. So punitive justice as a practitioner, Stan, whether it's easy for you to carry on your public health approach to your colleagues and to the policing world, and Ella about human trafficking around in particular organ trafficking. But then at the same time, if you could just sort of draw a sort of, again, perhaps for our listeners, an overview of what you think the situation. I mean, I know it's kind of quite depressing listening to you, Ella, and I know exactly where you're coming from, and I've had similar experiences about how, you know, we need to look at evidence, and yet evidence is very difficult to find. You know, we need to do lots of ethnographic studies if you want to get anywhere, because police data is quite limited. But what can we do going forward? And I know you've underlined already sort of some of the major problems, but perhaps as a kind of concluding remark, you can think about whether there's any positives going forward. So basically, I suppose I'm asking you to sort of wrap up some general thought around organised crime in the UK, if you had to answer an exam question or a quiz question of, you know, what's the outlook like? What is it kind of, you know, and is there any kind of positive thing that we can do going forward in terms of academics or practitioners or journalists? Ella, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I really am doom and gloom at the moment. I'm sorry. I hope
that's fine. That's fine. Don't worry about it. It's I think you reflect, you know, your evidence base, so that's what it is.
So things that give me hope. There are so many brilliant people out there working on these issues, including people that have incredible lived experience that they're bringing to bear, and they're asking to be, you know, listened to and taken seriously in ways that hasn't necessarily been the case to date, including people that are doing huge amounts of grassroots organizing, and people working in all sorts of different professions, you know, be it law, be it policing, be it social care, be it academia, journalists that are really kind of are critically engaging with these issues and are trying to think about what are better ways and pushing back against, you know, hype and simplification and the co-option of complex and very, very serious issues to serve particular narratives. So that gives me a huge amount of hope. It also gives me lots of people that I can fire off expletive-filled WhatsApp texts to, when otherwise you would just be bashing your head against the
I'll leave you. I'll
alone.
ask you to stop there with that positive. Otherwise, you'll go back to and we've only got 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes, positive. That's my biggest positive.
Yes, well, I think that's a good way to leave, a good place to leave it. Stan, have you got anything else to sort of summarise or be positive about?
Well, I think building on that that grassroots is an important feature, and building the evidence base is an important feature. If you can point to an evidence base, then you're on the right journey, even if policy and practice is taken in a different route. If you can always point to the evidence base, then you've got a compass there, haven't you? That lack of a substantive evidence base, one that we can subject to systematic review, is a real kind of important area that we need to plug, and it's an area that we in the VRU are trying to do a lot about. How do you mobilize? How do you implement? How do you build an evidence base sufficient for a kind of evaluation? So that gives me hope that we'll keep building an evidence base regardless.
Good, thank you. And Francesco, apart from submitting your manuscript, anything else positive?
Yeah, going to the pub later, I think that's the positive note. The main positive thing, honestly, I work with so many amazing people in my line of work, people I really respect and have been extremely blessed to meet. They're doing incredibly interesting, sensitively handled and brilliant bits of reportage. And I mean, to name a few, I've already named Max Daly. I think he does very good work on drugs. I'm familiar with Kieran Thapar. He wrote a book called Cut Short about youth services and youth violence. He's a youth worker in South London, but also a terrific writer. Yeah, and I know lots of people I feel really inspired by, and yeah, they're doing fantastic work. So I guess, if you can take, if one can take some of that energy, you're doing well, I suppose. But yeah, thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you very much to our three speakers. I'm getting the secretariat who are starting to send me messages about how many minutes we've got left, so I will stop there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. This talk was just one of 85 from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. To get access to the rest, head over to oc24.heysummit.com. Thanks for listening.